Good evening and welcome. We want to welcome tonight Dr. Askew and Dr. Thornton, and we also want to welcome everyone that is attending this event tonight. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us, and we're looking forward to a really good conversation. We want to give special thanks and recognition to our friends at the Prince George's County Memorial Library System who are partnering with us and who are hosting this event tonight. We really appreciate their continued efforts in bringing quality programming to all of the residents of the county. So tonight we welcome all of you in conversation with Dr. George Askew, Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Health, Human Services and Education for Prince George's County, and Dr. Alvin Thornton, Chair of the Board of Education of Prince George's County. And we will examine the question, does your zip code impact your whole life? How does where you live impact your health, your access to medical care, your education, and the resources available to you? How do these impacts affect you lifelong? So we'd like to start by hearing from Dr. Askew. In addition to his work for the county, where he oversees the health department, the Department of Social Services, and Department of Family Services, he is also a professor in the Department of Family Science at the University of Maryland, in their School of Public Health. He has also served as Deputy Commissioner of Health in the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. He was appointed under the Obama administration as the first Chief Medical Officer for the Administration of Children and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Additionally, he has done extensive work in child and family advocacy, including founding Docs for Tots, serving as the CEO and president of Jumpstart for Young Children, and serving as the Deputy CEO and Chief Development Officer for Voices for America's Children. In 2005, he was named as the Ashoka International Fellow, recognized as a national and global leader for his efforts linking health professionals with early childhood advocacy, embodying the ideals of civic engagement and creative solution building. It is our pleasure and our honor to welcome Dr. Askew here this evening. Dr. Askew.
Good evening, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's particularly to address this question. But first, I bring greetings from the county executive. It's truly an honor to serve in the also Brooks administration. I've served under many great leaders, presidents, mayors. And she takes a back seat to none in terms of her vision and inspiration. And so we are lucky as Prince Georgians to have her. The question to me was so obvious, the answer when someone says, does your zip code matter with respect to your health? I actually like to use the terminology, your zip code actually matters more than your genetic code, which shouldn't be the case, but is true. And when I think about whether or not this is a reality, I recognize that for me, this has been an issue that's been one of the cornerstones of my career. And I think the best way for me to express it, just to talk about it initially, is really to do it in stories, because it really does, maybe two, really does tell the tale, for me at least, of how zip code is more important than your genetic code when it comes to health outcomes. So it was back in the 90s when I was at Boston City Hospital and I was at Boston University as a junior faculty member there. And I was seeing clinical patients. I'm a pediatrician by training. And in an area where folks were facing the most significant social, economic, and health challenges. Before that, had been doing the same similar kind of work in Cleveland, Ohio, my hometown. And I was seeing a young mother and her two kids. One kid was around 4 years old. He had asthma, and the other was around 2 years old and had developmental delay. Mom, as part of the welfare to work legislation, which I have to say was terrible legislation that was put forward around that period, where folks were basically forced to their period on welfare shortened and forced into the workforce sometimes before they may have been ready, and certainly without their appropriate supports, in my opinion. But this mother had done everything right. She had worked hard to get herself off of welfare, to get a job, and to support herself. Again, as a single mom with these two kids, but she couldn't afford quality childcare or afford anyone to take care of her two children, and she didn't quite make enough to qualify for any subsidized programming. So she actually had to go back onto welfare and to be able to be with her children. So that's the first part of the story. And so where during my normal visit, I write a prescription for the child's asthma, send the other child or schedule the other child to go for a developmental assessment. And then I asked the question that often, when I was in clinical practice regularly, that often got me into trouble, but I thought it was always an important question to ask. So at the end of a visit is there anything else I can do for you today? Well, in this case, the mom looks at me and says, well, you know what, doc, I think my son needs therapy. And so I was a bit taken aback, of course, because I thought I had covered everything that needed to be covered during the visit. And so, took my hand off of the doorknob and said, let's sit down, let's talk about why you think your 4-year-old child needs therapy. And she said, well, he's killing mice. And for those of us who work with children, work particularly with young children, and hear about children who are killing animals, even mice, it sets off all sorts of bells and whistles about potential future psychopathology. And so really wanted to explore this. So again, had mom sit down and talk to me a little bit more. And, for me, it was a little heartbreaking. So I wanted to maybe I could put a positive spin on this. Like, maybe this kid's really ingenious and he set up these traps around the house to catch mice. So I said, so how does he catch the mice? And she said, well, they're running all over the apartment and they run over his bed. And so it's not that hard for him to catch them and kill them. And then he often gives them to his little brother to throw away. So now, I'm truly brokenhearted, and I'm angry because a mother who did everything we asked of her, and we didn't do right by her, and much of it driven by her environment, much of it driven by her geography, much of it driven by where she lived, her zip code. She was so broken by her environment that her only recourse for a child who's catching mice in the apartment that she lives in, who also has asthma, and having mice in the apartment was going to impact that as well. Her only recourse, she thought, was to ask for therapy for her child. So when I talked to her about, well, why not report this to the landlord? She says, well, I'm on Section 8 housing, and I'm afraid Section 8 housing, subsidized housing, government subsidized housing. I'm afraid I'm going to get kicked out of that housing if I complain. Again, beaten down by the system, but also beaten down by the system based on where she lived and what environment and what community she was in. So that, and stories like that about living circumstances of the people that I serve, drove me to do something different. In my office, I could treat the asthma with breathing medicine. I could give antibiotics for an ear infection or a bandage for a wound. But as an urban-based healthcare provider, I was continually frustrated because I didn't have a prescription to treat poverty, lack of access to social services, inadequate early care and education opportunities, food insecurity, unsafe environments, racism, and inadequate housing. These are all zip code related items, and folks often talk about the social determinants of health, but again, zip code related items, where you live, and they're all things that had a much greater impact on the health and well-being of the children and families I serve than any tool or prescription I had in my office. So since then, I've sought work in positions that allow me to address those broader issues. And currently, I'm able to address those issues at a county policy, health, and social services level. When I was in New York, we did a lot of work around equity, and we particularly looked at issues of area, where you lived and how it impacted your life. And we could see a 10-year length of life difference in just a subway ride. You could be a subway ride away from a community where you might live to be 75 years old, as opposed to a community where you might live to be 84 or 85 years old, based on the resources invested in that community over time. That's sort of a second story. But the last story, and maybe a much quicker story, is that when COVID happened, and when we were in the midst of the early throes of COVID, and everyone, all the media and all the reporting was, wow, why is it that Black and brown people are being more impacted by COVID? Everyone seemed so surprised, and it certainly wasn't something that surprised me. We have an overwhelming collection of evidence from epidemics, pandemics, natural disasters to show us that people who were facing the most significant social, economic, and health challenges before the catastrophic events are those who will suffer disproportionately more as a result of the event. Our country's continuing history of structural and institutional racism that in many places has gutted the health and human services infrastructures of communities of color. Again, where you live, where your zip code is, the poor and the socially disadvantaged has contributed greatly to disproportionate incidence of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, and other morbidities that in the time of catastrophic events like a pandemic, like COVID, are magnified. And this is your zip code being more important than your genetic code. There's no reason that Black and brown people should be suffering more from COVID other than where they are in communities that have been disinvested in and disenfranchised over time. So for me, I hope that as we look to target communities who need our help today during this outbreak, that we not forget those same communities when we emerge from this pandemic. They're going to need our attention and investment even more. And this will likely not be the last catastrophic event that many of us will see. And I hope that in future events, we're prepared to address them without the specter of disparity and inequity peering over our shoulder. And that, that as a surprise, one surprise I would welcome with open arms is not to have that disparity and specter peering over our shoulders. So I want us to make it so that our zip code doesn't matter how long or how well we live in good times or in bad times. So that's sort of my opening salvo on does your zip code impact your health? Absolutely does. Okay, and we're going to drill down a little bit more during our question and answer portion. But I do have lots of questions. Okay, and so thank you so much, Dr. Askew. We are now going to hear from Dr. Alvin Thornton. He will talk about education. He is the chairman of the Prince George's County Board of Education, serving in his 4th term as chair. Before retiring, Dr. Thornton was a professor of political science and department chair, associate provost, and senior advisor to the president of Howard University. Dr. Thornton chaired the Maryland State Commission, it was called the Thornton Commission,
that developed the formula that is used to allocate funding for public education. He is the author of the book, Like a Phoenix, I'll Rise, an illustrated history of Blacks in Prince George's County, Maryland, from 1696 to 1996. He is the recipient of several awards recognizing his leadership and service to the community. And we are very, very pleased and honored to have Dr. Thornton with us this evening. So Dr. Thornton, please.
And Attorney Battle Brooks, I'm honored to have been invited to be with you all this evening, and also to join with my colleague, Dr. Askew. We have developed a good, excellent working relationship in the service of Ms. Alster Brooks and the Board of Education and Dr. Gosen. And I was just telling him about the excellent leadership group that the county has assembled on behalf of the citizenry. So I'm happy to be a part of that. This is a very important issue in terms of whether zip code determines the quality of life of our children, in this case, education. When I think of that, I think of zip code, which was created in 1963. Most people know that, this concept, what they call the zone improvement plan. I don't think people ever thought when they created it, which was really designed to more efficiently deliver mail, that it would organize life in a way that could compromise citizenship, both in terms of education as well as healthcare and most aspects of life. Most importantly, in terms of the ability of people to accumulate wealth around which they can build quality healthcare as well as education. And when I grew up in the old days when we didn't have zip codes. We had Black people over here, white people over there. It was just that simple, right? You didn't need a zip code. You needed only a railroad track, and so you didn't need a zip code, or you needed an inner and an outer beltway in the early days of Prince George's County, or you needed South Side, East Side in most of our major cities. Now it's gotten down to the particularity of zip code. And this is what we're trying to overcome. We're trying to define citizenship in such a way that it is not an extension of, as Elijah Cummings said, who you are, to whom you're born, or where you can afford to live. Now, that's a very revolutionary American dream concept that we are all talking about. I think of the great ones who left us recently, Elijah Cummings that I just mentioned, Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, John Lewis, and others. They all were centered around unraveling this notion of citizenship defining one's rights and opportunities and access to life. That's what it was about. My life has been primarily focused on addressing the issue when it comes to education. In 1954, Thurgood says, there was no zip code in 1954, the great son of Maryland. He says that our children's education should not be a function of race, and states should not be able to, by law, assign students to educational space based upon their race. And thankfully, to the great struggles of Thurgood and others, we were able to at least constitutionalize that concept. It didn't do anything, though, about the question of resource adequacy for children in terms of where they live, and not necessarily the school in which they might be enrolled. Because we really had in our country, and to some extent we do still have informally, education being a function of the value of the property around which children live. And the income that happens to come into that house, particularly historically from the father, but now disproportionately when it comes to Black and Latino children, the mother. And so the question for us is, what is the role of the state in mediating against those systemic things that I just mentioned? What is the role of the state? Because one of the things that we do, unfortunately, we fund education based upon property tax that is municipally based. Not property tax that is based on the state or even a region, but property tax that is based upon municipality. And largely what we do is that we situate children in municipal residential existences, and we draw lines around them. And when we then value the land or the property that they're in and the houses that they're in, and then we say fund their education based upon that. That creates great inequality. We've made some progress in terms of eliminating the degree of inequality that extends from those systemic and institutional forces. But we have a lot of work to do in that regard. It's particularly important because one of the phenomena that has evolved around our children is that there's a growing systemic geometric increases in childhood poverty. So we have childhood education being an extension of their proximity to wealth and property, and then childhood poverty growing. Those two things running parallel creates great toxicity, malalignment, dissonance, and issues in our community. And this is what we're really trying to struggle against. I think the greatness of our society now is the extent to which we can eliminate that. When I was on the board in the 1990s in Prince George's, we would assess our children's academic performance and expectations, and we had very high expectations for them in the state. We call it Maryland School Assessment Program, starting in 1994. Those were universally imposed statutorily, but we did not universally impose resourcing for the children in order to equip them to achieve at the levels that we expected. Starting in 2002, thankfully, the people of Maryland, Prince George's County, we then begin to marry the expectations with the expected resourcing. And that's what people call Thornton. It was an upgrading of Thurgood into that we call it Bridge to Excellence. And what we have now is a continued evolution of that journey into what we now call Kerwin, which is saying that children should not be a function of the zip code, the county, the community in which they live. They are Maryland's children. They're not Prince George's children, Montgomery children, Talbot children. They are Maryland's children. And we have, Thurgood went to the people and said, the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause requires you to treat all children equally. We as Marylanders, thanks to our leadership across the board, we've said that we have in Article 8, Section 2 clause of our Constitution, joined with the equal protection provision that says we will treat all of our children equally, notwithstanding where they live, to whom they are born or the accident of birth, or the ability of their father or mother to purchase a home. Now that is so good of us as a state, as a county. It is very difficult. I'm not naive. It's very difficult to do because you have to fund it, you have to finance it. But the first thing you have to do is believe it, right? I don't think Thurgood ever thought in '54 that overnight. I grew up in a segregated apartheid Southern system like John Lewis. I don't think he ever thought overnight that system would be torn down, but he believed, he dreamed, and we got there. The same is true in our communities across America. We will reach a point where wealth differences will be a suspect classification, and we will not allocate children's educational opportunities based upon their wealth status. In 1973, the Supreme Court decided, that's why I'm so sad by the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The Supreme Court decided in a case called San Antonio versus Rodriguez that wealth status was not a suspect classification. In other words, you could classify children based upon the wealth of their parents and give them a benefit like education. And if that benefit came out unequally, that was not a violation of our Constitution. Now that was in 1973. We're still trying to overcome that constitutional deficit so that as our children, in most communities, 63% of the children are economically poor. And that means that's an indication of their wealth status. And so if that is not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of our state as well as our country, then we have a problem. So I have faith that we're going to do this. The first thing we have to do is understand the narrative that I'm explaining. We have to educate people about the constitutional statutory expectation of what the state will do for our children, what government will do for our children, and then mobilize majorities around that. I'm convinced, my colleagues, that we will be able to do that, and our children's lives will not be a function of zip code. Otherwise, and I'll then stop on this point, otherwise, we will build communities around these artificial constructions of life. We'll build communities, people who develop communities, build homes, and then we'll create electoral majorities around that reality. And that stuff will just, it'll just take on a life of its own. We have an opportunity, I think, to prevent that from happening. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, both of you raised such very, very good points. And as we can see, all of these things that we're talking about wealth, zip code, health, education, redlining, food deserts, on and on, are all intermingled, that we can't separate them. We really can't. And so a question, so let's bring it back to the health just for a moment, and then Kyla and Nick are going to feed questions that some may have. But, Dr. Askew, you talked about the social determinations of health, and you sketched a little bit of that, as well as some of the diseases or some of the medical issues that come from that. But can you unpack that just a little bit more to give maybe some in our audience that have never thought about this?
Sure. When you think about some of the illnesses that are most greatly impacted by social issues, environment, access to financial resources, take something like obesity. A big challenge in many communities throughout the country, a big challenge in our community. I'll sort of tell you a story because I think these often illustrate the circumstances. Working with a child in an urban community in the hospital, one of the things you're going to recommend, or we would recommend to a child who came in, said, well, we should get the child out for exercise as much as possible. Take the kid to the park. Take them out for strolls. Take them out for a bike ride. Well, if you live in a community that's been built up and everyone sort of pushed into stacked housing, no green space, no safe areas, community again that's sort of been disinvested in, and I've had a parent look me in the eye and say, I can't let my child outside without my protection. I can't let them go out and play. And she said, and her words were, I don't want my child to become a statistic. And even though I grew up in an urban setting in Cleveland, I would often ask my mother, like, did you ever feel afraid to send me outside? I didn't feel afraid to send you outside. So I said to this mother, I said, are you genuinely afraid to send your child outside? And she said, absolutely. I think my child could be killed. So I'd rather have my child inside and overweight than risk that. And then you make another suggestion. Well, try to change the diet for you and the family and the child, buy more fresh fruits and vegetables, affordable fresh fruits and vegetables. Where are you going to find that when your food access is the bodega on the corner that is there and is convenient and is great for you to have it there, but doesn't have the kind of variety and can't have the margin for prices that would allow them to bring in fresh fruits and vegetables. And then on top of that, you've got marketers who prey on these settings and give you, cheap soda. And when it's cheap and you have access to it, you're going to use that because that's what's available. And high calorie dense foods at a low price are what folks are going to go for. And those are the businesses that come into the communities that are left uninvested in by other businesses. And so that's just the obesity example of social determinants having a great impact on the ability to combat disease and illness.
Yes, you're right. I know that it was shocking for me to learn when I worked at the state's attorney's office that, for some people, the 7-Eleven who are on subsidy is the place that they buy their groceries, the 7-Eleven where there's nothing fresh, or very little fresh, I should say. And I know that our boss, County Executive Angela Also Brooks, is very committed to eradicating the food deserts within our county. It reminds me of something Dr. Chris Marsh said. She is a professor at the University of Maryland in sociology.
Just on the call with her before this.
Okay, yes, and she's amazing. And she was giving an example on a meeting, it's probably a webinar that I was on. I think it was about redlining, actually. And she was relaying a friend of hers who was a physician, and he was a physician that dealt with transplants. And so she was highlighting the disparities in policies that have disparate treatment. For instance, if you want a kidney transplant, some of the policies, and you would know, what you have to go to dialysis a certain amount of times a week, you have to have fresh food. And so we're back to the same notion that if you don't have fresh food that you have access to, then you're not going to get on the list to have a kidney transplant. If you have to decide whether you have to go to work, catch 3 buses and walk a mile or whatever it is to get to work versus trying to get your dialysis and miss one day, then the policy. So I guess my question is, what can we do with this new awakening? And Dr. Thornton, I'm going to ask you a very similar question, but with this new awakening that we as a country have, when we talk about systems of disparity, systems that are put in place and work exactly as they were supposed to, but in terms of in some of the negative ways as well. But what can we do to start affecting policy besides sort of, this awareness that we're trying to bring to our citizens?
Well, I'll use my own career as an example. I started in the clinical practice office and saw that rather than just having an impact on one child, one family, one neighborhood at a time, to try to be in position to affect greater communities, a nation, even did work internationally to try to have sort of a global impact. But one of the reasons that I do the work that I do personally is because I think still the lever that makes the biggest difference is policy and law. When it becomes law, it's difficult to get around. The problem is many of the laws historically have been set up to disenfranchise and to disadvantage, particularly people of color, and to disadvantage people in particular neighborhoods, in particular surrounding. And in fact, a lot of the laws drove people into those neighborhoods. So for me, I am still a big fan of the vote. We have an election coming up. I think if you're not happy with the situation, the way things are, one of the things you can do is vote in people who you want to see in office, or keep people in office who you want to see in office. Not taking any sides here. I take the side. I always say I take the side of children. Children it's not a political issue. Children, they're all our children. So I vote on behalf of children. So I would love to see folks really get out, particularly in this upcoming election, and exercise their right to vote and make those big changes. I always said, in the office, I can fix that one illness. I can give you an antibiotic, your ear infection goes away. If I get a piece of policy moved, when I worked in the Obama administration, and when we started doing work on the home visiting legislation, when all of a sudden there was $4.5 billion of money available to give to home visiting across the country, that was a tremendous leap forward, and the kind of leap forward that you can't make without making policy and legal changes.
Yeah. And I guess to that end, Dr. Thornton, there's so many things that happen policy-wise that for us as average citizens, we don't understand sort of the impact or the long range. Very much like Dr. Thornton, you said when the zip code was started or invented in 1963, that no one could imagine that this type of thing would have the effect that we're talking about now. And so if there's one thing that you would give a citizen in terms of advice, if they're saying, what can I do? What can I do to start trying to get change? What would you give them?
Well, uh, the person has to have a sense of political possibility and empowerment, of what we call political agency. A person has to not feel powerless, vulnerable, can't do, etc. But I want to go back and say this, that we have to, as we talk about education and health, our nation is at a point of great stress because of the basic foundations that support what Dr. Askew and I are talking about are being weakened, and we have to address that. Because at the end of the day, the results of what we are talking about is policed. And a lot of the stuff that you're seeing now in Louisville tonight is a result of these systemic issues coming to bear and being policed. Policed in a way that's racially specific, that results in police brutality sometimes. So we have to come up with a better quality of life that does not have to be managed and controlled by policing. Now that, to me, these people that we're talking about, whether it's in education or healthcare, they all must have access to a livable wage, because you have to have the ability to constitute families where there's income coming into the family, the husband and the wife, or however the family is formed, can have resources for the children. You have to have reasonable universal access to healthcare. That's not a function of how much money you make and where you live. And you know that is a major issue that is before us, right? And we have to have a taxation system. Our taxation system nationally and statewide is so regressive, and it hurts people who don't have, and those people who have get more. So we must address the regressivity because wealth is being concentrated at a historically high level away from those who do not have to those who do have, which is causing all kinds of convulsions in our system. So I think whatever we do, we're going to have to share wealth with families and children. We're not doing that. When you have 4 families that own more than the bottom half of all Americans, that's unsustainable. No one would argue for that, even those who are in that category. It creates problems in healthcare and education and everything else.
Yes. I see 2 questions here in the chat. With the Supreme Court ruling of 1973, does that preclude there being a legal challenge to the inequity of schooling as it relates to parents, income, neighborhood is the first part? Is there a legal challenge that could work or start to work effectively to equalize access to education?
The 1973 case that I referenced and the questioner is inquiring about is that case of San Antonio versus Rodriguez. Now, the Supreme Court eviscerated the protective umbrella of Brown over our children, and that is no longer there. When I was growing up, probably Dr. Askew, everyone talked about Brown versus Board, and everyone was talking about Thurgood Marshall. Well, the Supreme Court eviscerated that. So there is no federal protection of the education equality for our children because the word education is not in the U.S. Constitution. So the due process equal protection clause is not there. Thankfully, the people of Maryland, this is what I'm most proud of, starting with the Sylvester Barnes case here in Prince George's County, which was in 1973, the Bradford cases coming out of Baltimore City, which dealt with this issue, and now the cases that are now driving the energy and stimulus for what the state of Maryland is doing is looking at Article 8, Section 2 of the Maryland Constitution, litigating that where necessary, but thankfully our politicians have been responsive enough to respond without continued litigation. We had a case in our own county, which was the Barnes versus the Prince George's County Board, that we finally settled in 1998. That's the case that we settled, which resulted in the building of schools and resourcing our schools. Judge Massetti there in Greenbelt decided that case. It was a good case. So in answer to the question, yes, there is litigation possibilities based upon the state constitution and not based upon the federal constitution. Now, parents have to know that because my fundamental position, as Thurgood Marshall said to Strom Thurmond in South Carolina, states and politicians do not have the right to treat children unequally when it comes to education. Don't have that right. no matter what majorities you put together electorally, you don't have the right that you can sue government as Thurgood did, or as the people of Maryland did in the 1970s and 80s, and force government to do right on behalf of their children. That is because citizenship is not something that's granted by majority votes. That's a fundamental right that human beings have under our Constitution.
Hear, 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 hear. And children are gifts, and you know, they can't vote, and so sometimes I believe that is why sometimes they get the short end of the stick. I'll just say one thing more about that. I used to prosecute child abuse and sexual assault crimes, and our child abuse laws came out of our animal cruelty laws. So we had laws dealing with animal cruelty before we had laws dealing with child abuse.
That's very true. They cannot vote. I think that's why our obligation to protect them is even more heightened.
That is exactly the point. That is exactly the point. We do not value children, and they are the most precious thing we have, as well as being our future. So,
Indeed.
Another question. Is it fair to say that busing failed to make school access equitable? I know some areas where access remains very inequitable, but did it make any big improvements at all? Question from our chat.
Let's see, busing was first ruled as a mechanism that governments could use in order to make sure that Black children had access to the resources that white children had. Because in those days, white people just simply moved away from Black children and took their resources with them. In the early days, they would move outside of the Beltway and simply take the resources with them. Well, the federal court said that we'll just simply order busing as a remedy, so you can't get away. The children will follow you because they have access. Busing was never the best way to address it because it created I was never a big fan of busing. It creates great dissidence in the community, division and all of that. But it was the only way that you could force politicians to respond to the legitimate demands of parents. And that's why when in our own county in 1998, when we settled finally the desegregation order and stopped busing, that was the consent decree that stopped busing. And we could finally get about the business of doing what we needed to do, which was to provide quality education to all children. But busing was a necessary tool to get, it was a necessary hammer because keep in mind that in those days throughout America, Black people did not have the equal right to vote. They didn't have equal offices. They were not on county councils and school boards. So the only thing they had was the federal judges to order busing to their children to get equal rights. Thankfully now we're in positions and we have that responsibility now.
Yes. I'm sometimes amazed at just when I tune on television and sometimes people are doing polls asking sort of civic questions, basic American civic government questions. And people don't understand sort of the three co-equal, they don't understand the way our government works. Have we stopped teaching government or whatever it is called? In my day, I think it was called government in 7th grade, American government.
Yeah, I think and I'm not decrying this because it was necessary. We were falling behind in terms of the area of STEM, but we really got into STEM education and science and technology, engineering and math, and that was good. And I think we forgot about the importance of civic education. And one of the great deficits, as we see now in our presidency and in the quality of life at that level, that we have a major deficit in terms of civic understanding. Most people don't even know who their U.S. senators are. They don't know the district in which they vote. They don't know who the names of their representatives, and they do not vote. So I think we need to elevate civic education. I call it civic literacy. The Board of Education, as you might recall, we just passed a financial literacy requirement for all of our students. I always argue that we need a civic literacy requirement for all of our students, because if they don't understand government, the way government works, the importance of voting, then they'll not be able to be competitive financially.
No, I quite agree. I remember speaking with a victim survivor of a particular crime I was prosecuting, and he was bemoaning sort of his treatment. He happened to live in the District of Columbia, but the crime occurred in Prince George's County, and was decrying sort of his treatment. And I said, well, why don't you get engaged? I gave him sort of a civic lesson. He was maybe 23. And he was just astounded that he had sort of this power. I said, we were formed as America, grassroots. This is what moved. And we have just kind of all fallen asleep and not taken that power back. And it is ours as citizens, as people, grassroots, to say this is acceptable, this is not. So, yes.
Well, I won't, and I'll be quiet because I'm kind of hogging the discussion. But I'm 72 years old, and I've never seen I won't get political, but I've never seen a threat to the basic fabric of our constitutional civic system as we are now confronting. So I'll take this moment to say to the people who may be watching that it's urgently important that all people participate and all people vote, because I've never seen the kind of threat that I now see to our constitutional system.
Yes. So, Dr. Askew, you're not off the hook. Yes. You talked about the infrastructure of healthcare being gutted, and it kind of goes more to sort of making all of us aware. So it's sort of three parts. How was it gutted? What can we do post? And the third, I think the most important, so maybe that comes after how, but what are some of the things we as citizens, when we talk about civic literacy, what are some of the things we as citizens, if we hear something on the news or we hear something that should trigger for us, wait a minute, we need to pay attention here, because this is not really about that issue. Here is the long range impact. So if you could unpack that a little bit about maybe how it was gutted, what we should have been aware of, how did this happen?
Sure. So I won't drag out the answers on some of these, but how it was gutted is through a history of structural and institutional, from my perspective, structural and institutional racism, where policies, laws were put into place that would take away resources or unfairly disadvantage people in certain communities. You mentioned redlining as one of them early on. So it's been in some respects you could say gradual, but not gradual. You could also say it's 401 years of this kind of intentional structural barriers to success and succeeding. Secondly, you said, well, what was the second part? Well,
one part of a policy on its own may not look significant. The impact may not look significant. So how do we become aware if we see something to say, wait a minute, this triggers it?
Well, I think folks have to recognize and I think one of the things that Dr. Thornton talked about, he talked about agency, that we do still have agency. Individuals have agency. Don't underestimate the impact of one voice, two voices, 10 voices coming together to demand change. I think, well, what is the old saying? Only those who have not spent sort of one night in the inside of a house with one mosquito can understand the strength of one voice at the right time. So I think folks have to believe that they can, through their voice, through their advocacy, their self-advocacy, make a change. I think you're seeing that in the civic upheaval that's happening in the country right now. I think folks are fed up and are saying, you know what, we have a voice. We're demanding change. My hope is that this has happened in the past, and we've gotten one or two steps further. There's so many steps to take. My goal, my hope is to see an accelerated future, that we don't have to take these baby steps, that these voices that we're hearing now use this opportunity, particularly this opportunity of COVID, of the tragedy of George Floyd, of the complete debacle that is Breonna Taylor, the heartbreak that is, and turn it into the kind of rapid change we all seek and demand.
Yes, I agree. I really echo what you say, but it's also making your voice heard is extremely important, but you also have to vote, because as soon as the next shiny object comes along and the focus is turned and the media no longer is highlighting it, the vote is what's going to matter in terms of, putting in people that will affect the policies that you as a citizen and grassroots demand change, demand. The politicians work for us.
That's one of the reasons why I have been so pleased, going back to education for me, I've been so pleased with the role that our athletes are now playing in educating.
Yes.
Because so much of life, particularly in the Black community, it filters through athletics and entertainment and the arts. And one of the things that has been done over the past 30 years or so was to separate that life and make it non-political. And now what we have seen, most powerfully, something that people like me could never do, what our athletes are now doing, from LeBron James and others who are taking the attention that our young people have in schools and sports and whatever, and saying, look, there's a political dimension to this. Use your athletic consumer space in order to empower yourself. That is so refreshing.
Yes.
For me to see that happening. I think it's going to help the nation, by the way, because it's going to help to politically educate our young people and make them more involved.
No, I agree. And I like, I don't remember which athlete said it, but when they decided we're not going to play, the phrase was, sports, this is entertainment. This is something that when your Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? When you've ascertained a certain place in society, that this is something that it's entertainment. He's like, we need to go back to what the issues are. We're not at the entertainment phase yet.
And I say that because we do talk about these communities where these children are in their schools. And many of us have, and I think this is one of the things that I've been so pleased with Dr. Askew and others, as we try to create a positive empowerment narrative about our children and communities. We don't just describe them as pathologies and problems and what's wrong, and that we don't rank them. We go there and we say there are empowerment dimensions that already exist. There's a story of the type that Dr. Askew is telling that reflects empowerment, and we share those stories with them and ourselves, and then we move up together. And we don't look outside back in and say pathologically, this is what's wrong with you. You live in this zip code and you live in this community. No, that's negative, that's pathological, that's not empowerment. And that's one of the things that I'm seeing now, certainly in our county, a narrative of empowerment with leadership going with the community, lifting them up.
That's right. One of the programs I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago with our partners, library, the author Jason Reynolds was on, very well-known national author, and he is a Prince Georgian or grew up here. And one of the things that he said really struck me when you say this, Dr. Thornton, because he said he grew up in Oxon Hill, and he said there was sort of the thing, if you were from the hills or the heights or some of those that, your experience in Prince George's County was much different from if you were from the belts or, some of the other places that he simply didn't go until he was a little older in high school. And so it was sort of a revelation. So yeah, we have to make everything the same. Let's see, I think we have time for one more question. And this question from the chat is from Dr. Askew, and you may have covered this, but let's see. Are there things that we as, let's say, average folks rather than policymakers, can do on the ground level to help address health and food resource inequity?
I think one of the things that one of my goals for the county is to change the culture around how we control our own destiny around health. So, to challenge the community to take some personal responsibility, at the same time creating opportunities for folks to more easily take better control and better care of themselves. So that's certainly one thing. Continue to, as I said, demand from our leadership, to make food available to, if you're then going to buy into taking control of your health and well-being, then it makes it a lot easier for you to make those demands. Like, I'm trying to do the best I possibly can for my family. I want to give fresh foods. I want to have to exercise and have green space available. But you folks have to work with us. The last thing I'll say on that is, Dr. Thornton hinted at it, and that is we're creating a child-friendly county. Where one of the major emphases of that is that we bring the voice of the child to the fore. We want to sort of make room for the voice of children and young people in decisions about their lives. We've sort of had our bite at the apple, and it's time for this next generation or generations to have their opportunity to lead, to determine their destination. There's some things that we didn't get right, clearly, and they'll tell you, but you got to listen to them. And it's taken me a while now with my 23-year-old and 27-year-old, and I listen a lot more these days than I have in the past, and I'm learning a lot more about the way the world's going to be shaped in the future, and I think it's going to be a better place because some of us older folks are listening.
Yes, this reminds me, Dr. Askew, if you would, creating child-friendly county, this was the United Nations initiative. Could you just in 1 minute or 30 seconds explain what that is?
It's a UNICEF initiative that began internationally, where there are multiple child-friendly cities across the world. They just started the Child-Friendly Cities initiative here in the U.S. We are in the first cohort of areas. So I think it's Houston, San Francisco, Chicago, and Prince George's County that are pursuing child-friendly county status, child-friendly city status. And it's about the rights of the children. What do children have the right to, and how do we as a county provide that? And it's a very intentional look at how we support, nurture, raise, and empower our children.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. Well, we have 2 minutes left, and I want to thank both of you so very much. It's a lot of food for thought, no pun intended, because that is one of the issues that we have. But this is just the beginning. We at the Human Relations Commission are going to have several conversations in this series. Does your zip code affect the rest of your life, basically, or how does it? And so we, again, thank you both for bringing the awareness to both of these subjects. And we want to just let everyone know about some of our other programs that are coming up. On September 29th, we have a continuing series called The Elephant We Don't See, Diversity Dialogue. And on that evening, the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo will be discussed. And we have one of our very own, Kyla Hannington, boy, that was bad. Kyla Hannington from the Human Relations Commission, and Michelle from our library partner. And they have a program, the fourth Tuesday, I guess it is, of every month. And it's the Elephant We Don't See, Diversity Dialogue. So please join us for that. On October 6th, we have the second in our series, Voting, Democracy in Action. And this time, we will have Dr. Joshua Davis from the University of Baltimore, investigator Langston Clay from our office, and Doneen Banks from the Prince George's County Board of Elections. Dr. Davis will talk about the voting laws, how it came to be. Now, we had this event on August 31st, and so we have sort of a foundation. He will just review that a little bit. And this time, we're going to drill down a little bit more about voter suppression, and particularly the African-American vote history in America. So please join us for that on October 6th. And I'm sorry, and Doneen Banks will talk about the nuts and bolts of voting and where we are right now and how you can, if you wish to vote. Remember, October 13th is the deadline to register for voting. And Langston Clay from our office will talk about family tradition, his family tradition of voting. On October 7th, the next day, we're going to have in conversation the author, Dr. Eddie Glaude. He's going to talk about his new book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. On October 8th, we're going to feature with our library partner, all of these are with our library partner, Carter Sickle, The Prettiest Star, and that is in support and highlighting LGBTQ+ History Month. That's October 8th. And like I said before, we have a second part of this conversation. Does your zip code affect your entire life? Stay tuned for dates for that. And I want to thank, again, Dr. Askew, Dr. Thornton. I want to thank our Prince George's County Memorial Library System for their time and efforts, and in particular, our library COO, Nick Brown, who is running the tech this evening behind the scenes. So we thank him. And we thank you. I'm Renée Battle-Brooks, Executive Director of the Prince George's County Human Relations Commission, and we hope that you join us for all of our programs. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.